Next up, podcast listeners, Harvard needs oboe players. You might wonder about this title. So in the Daily Caller, we have a great story. And this is really important because it goes right to merit. Why merit is important, which we've talked about before in this podcast. Supreme Court Justice John Roberts called out Harvard University's race-conscious admissions policies in an oral argument over a lawsuit that decides whether universities' use of affirmative action is constitutional. During the oral arguments of the case, Students for Fair Admissions versus President and Fellows of Harvard, Roberts, the Chief Justice, asked Harvard's lawyer, Seth Waxman, if the university uses race as a determining factor during the admissions process. Waxman admitted that race is taken into consideration in the same way that being an oboe player in a year in which the Harvard Radcliffe Orchestra needs an oboe player will be the tip. In other words, Waxman, who's defending Harvard, saying, well, we have an orchestra at Harvard, and if we have a hole in the orchestra where we need an oboe player, we're going to consider that. And so that's no different than race, which is what Waxman is saying. Roberts responds as follows, quote, "We did not fight a civil war about oboe players," Roberts replied to Waxman. "We did fight a civil war to eliminate racial discrimination. And that's why it's a matter of considerable concern. I think it's important for you to establish whether or not granting a credit based solely on skin color is based on a stereotype when you say this brings diversity to a viewpoint." Matt, thoughts on this? This is important.
I think it's very important. And I'm John Roberts. I've always had some issues with some of his rulings in the past, but he's dead on accurate in this case.
What's interesting, because Matt, because I want to hear from you about this, because there are many conservatives who say, well, Harvard is right because there are too many Asians that would be getting into Harvard. It would be an all-Asian school because Asians score so well.
Well, conservatives wouldn't say that.
I've actually heard Democrats say this.
I've heard Democrats say it.
And I've heard a couple of conservatives say this. And I think we need to get people back on track, which is if you really do believe in merit, okay, and you believe that scores matter and substance matters in order to be able to get into a school, and I'm talking about pure substance, like what is your SAT? What is your GPA? What is your reading comprehension? Bam.
Well, look, I think affirmative action was created because you had historical discrimination against African Americans.
Yes.
And it was almost like the reason they created it was for makeup, to get people ahead and give them a better opportunity. My question is, when does that ever expire?
Right.
You look at institutions like Harvard, which is a pretty big deal. They're actively discriminating against Asians.
They are. Of course, I agree.
And I mean, I think the last study I saw said the average Asian needed a SAT score 400 points higher or something like that to even be considered. And look, I just think in the year 2022 that we should be past these racial. I mean, think about it. Like coming up with a system that judges people whether you can further your academic obligations, your achievement, your academic goals.
Whether it be successful in the school.
Whether it be successful based on skin color.
Yes.
It sounds like a plan that came up with by the KKK.
Yes. Well, wait a minute. Didn't the Democrat Party, weren't they the ones that were the party of the KKK? Oh, yeah, that's right.
And Jim Crow.
So get this. Along with the same line.
I mean, he mentioned the Civil War. Didn't the Civil War end when Republican Abraham Lincoln defeated Democrat Jefferson Davis? If we're going to make everything political, and that's how we started off the podcast.
So get this. Conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito appeared to troll a lawyer defending affirmative action during oral hearings for a major case that could upend the race-based admission system. The High Court is hearing oral arguments challenging race-based affirmative action at Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Edward Blum, an anti-affirmative action activist, argued that the University of North Carolina discriminates against whites and Asian Americans, while Harvard affirmative action is discriminatory towards Asian Americans, according to Reuters. The suits were originally filed in 2014, with one accusing Harvard of violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. The University of North Carolina was accused of violating the 14th Amendment, according to Reuters. The challengers argue admissions should be colorblind. So what's interesting about this is there's this really quick exchange, and North Carolina Solicitor General Brian Park was the person who was basically supporting the university in North Carolina, because obviously it's a state university. Think about this. It's a state university that is engaging in racism of applicants based on obviously the way they look, because they don't want too many people looking the same way when they get into the school. So Justice Alito has this exchange, pretty interesting. Listen to it. We have the clip. Here it is.
It's family lore that we have an ancestor who was an American Indian.
So I think in that particular circumstance, it would be not accurate for them to say.
Well, I identify as an American Indian because I've always been told that some ancestor back in the old days was an American Indian.
Yeah, so I think in that circumstance, it would be very unlikely that that person was telling the truth. And the same is true for, we rely on self-reporting for all the demographic and other characteristics that we ask for. And there's nothing special about the racial identification on that score.
So that's the Solicitor General of North Carolina saying, he says, you self-report what your race is. But then at the same time, when Justice Alito says, well, what if I identify as Native American because I've always been told by my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents.
You mean like Elizabeth Warren?
Just like, yeah, Pocahontas. And so, and then, of course, the Solicitor General of North Carolina goes, well, that would be a different case because then we would know that you were self-reporting something that wasn't true. Well, how would you know? This is the whole point of why this case is so important, ladies and gentlemen, because
it's just crazy that we're raised in the words of Martin Luther King. You judge a man by the content of his character, not by the color of his skin. We're about 50 years past that from the civil rights movement of the 60s. Just for the country to move forward, you just need to move forward like with fairness and transparency.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. And that makes perfect sense to me. That's what a normal society would do. But
that's what America has always done.
Yes, merit. It's merit-based. And that's why we decided to talk about this today on Mark and the Millennials, because this is so commonsensical. And when you heard the Solicitor General of North Carolina trying to explain the acceptance policy, he really couldn't explain it. It was...
Well, because it's arbitrary and capricious.
Completely, yes.
And
we like the way he looks.
This is an important thing to realize about America. While there's been definitely wrongs in the past, our society is self-correcting.
Exactly.
And we've went from, slavery was a horrible stain in our history. Mm-hmm. And we fought our bloodiest war that we ever had to end it. And what always got me is in our state, we used to have this statue out there of Tawney, who, made the Dred Scott decision.
Roger Brooks Tawney. Yep.
Yeah. And, we took that statue down a couple years ago because they didn't want to celebrate it because of the racist decision that the Dred Scott decision was. I was against taking that statue down off the simple reason that right next to that statue was Thurgood Marshall, our first Black Supreme Court justice. And you couldn't tell the story of America, you couldn't tell the accurate story of Thurgood Marshall without Tawney. So Tawney made a horrible racist decision. And then 100 years later, we had an African-American sitting in the same position from the same state. I mean, that should be celebrated, that the country made that big a stride, because no other place in the world has done that much for race relations.
No, it's a great last comment.